Why does resting sometimes make you feel guilty? You finally have nothing that needs to be done. No crisis, no deadline, no one asking anything from you. So you sit down, and instead of feeling relief, you feel something else. Restlessness, guilt, a quiet voice telling you that you should be doing something, checking something, fixing something, achieving something. You tell yourself you'll rest after you've finished everything. But everything is never finished. There is always another message, another task, another goal, another reason to postpone the moment when you finally allow yourself to stop. And perhaps the strangest part is this. You can be completely exhausted and still feel guilty for resting, as though your body has permission to stop, but your mind doesn't. So you keep moving, not because you have somewhere to go, but because being still forces you to confront a question you have been avoiding. Who are you when you're not producing anything? Because somewhere along the way, productivity may have stopped being something you do and quietly become evidence of who you believe you are. When you're achieving, you feel valuable. When you're useful, you feel secure. When you're busy, you feel in control. But when you stop, something inside you becomes uncomfortable. And this is where the problem becomes deeper than productivity. You may not be afraid of wasting time. You may be afraid that without your achievements, there is nothing left to prove that you matter. Carl Jung's psychology gives us a different way to look at this. Because the identity you present to the world, the capable one, the ambitious one, the productive one, can become a persona, a role you build, a version of yourself that earns approval. And eventually, you can become so identified with that role that taking a break feels like stepping outside yourself. You don't simply think, I'm resting. Some deeper part of you whispers, I'm falling behind. And suddenly, rest feels like failure. Maybe you've noticed something strange about yourself. You can be exhausted enough to know you need rest and still feel guilty the moment you stop. You finish everything you were supposed to do, sit down for the first time all day, and instead of relief, your mind immediately starts negotiating. I should probably answer that message. I could clean something. I haven't worked out today. Maybe I should use this time to learn something. I'm already sitting here. I might as well be productive. And suddenly, rest has become another problem to solve. You don't know how to simply be still, because somewhere along the way, stillness stopped feeling like peace. It started feeling like evidence. Evidence that you're falling behind. Evidence that you're wasting time. Evidence that someone else is moving faster than you. Evidence that you aren't doing enough. And when that feeling appears, you move again. Not necessarily because something needs to be done, but because doing makes the discomfort disappear. For a while, this is where productivity becomes psychologically interesting, because there is nothing wrong with wanting to accomplish things. Ambition isn't the problem. Discipline isn't the problem. Wanting to build something meaningful with your life isn't the problem. The problem begins when achievement becomes the language through which you measure your right to exist. When a productive day makes you feel worthy, and an unproductive day makes you feel ashamed. When finishing something gives you temporary permission to feel good about yourself, but resting feels like something you have to justify, then productivity isn't simply productivity anymore. It has become self-worth in disguise, and you may not even realize it. You might call yourself ambitious. You might say you simply have high standards. You might tell yourself that you don't like wasting time. All of that may be true, but beneath it, there can be another voice. A quieter one that asks, if I'm not accomplishing something, what exactly makes me valuable? That question can be frightening, because if you have spent years building an identity around being capable, productive, responsible, and successful, then rest removes the evidence. For a few hours, there is nothing to point to. No completed task, no achievement, no progress, no external proof. Just you. And the unconscious doesn't always like that. Carl Jung's concept of the persona helps us understand why. The persona is the face you develop for the world, the version of yourself that knows how to function, how to perform, how to be admired, how to meet expectations. And there is nothing inherently wrong with having a persona. We all need one. The problem begins when you become so identified with it that you forget there is a person underneath the performance. You become the successful one, the disciplined one, the reliable one, the ambitious one, the one who always has something going on. And then one day, you try to rest and discover that you don't know who you are without the role. That is why some people feel strangely empty on quiet days. Not because they don't enjoy peace, but because there is no longer anything distracting them from themselves. When you're busy, you have structure. When you're achieving, you have direction. When you're solving problems, you have purpose. But when everything becomes quiet, the questions you've been outrunning can finally catch up. Am I actually happy? What am I doing all of this for? Would I still feel valuable if nobody praised me? Who am I when nobody is impressed? And perhaps the deepest question, would I still believe I am enough if I stopped proving it? This is why rest can feel more threatening than work. Work gives you something to prove. Rest gives you nothing to hide behind. And that is where the unconscious belief begins revealing itself. You don't necessarily fear rest. You fear what rest seems to say about you. That you're not moving. That you're not improving. That you're not becoming more. That you're not earning your place. So you turn rest into something that must be deserved. You tell yourself, I'll rest when I've finished this. Then you finish it. And immediately there is another thing. So you say, after this week, the week ends. Another week begins. After I reach this goal, you reach it, and the goal simply moves further away. Eventually, you realize something uncomfortable. You were never actually waiting for the work to end. You were waiting for a moment when you would finally feel worthy of stopping. And that moment never arrives. Because the unconscious rule was never rest when the work is finished. It was, you are allowed to rest only when you have proven that you deserve it. And no amount of achievement can satisfy a rule like that. Because the standard keeps changing. You can always do more, earn more, learn more, build more, improve more, become more. There is always another version of yourself waiting somewhere in the future, and the present version is never quite enough. So you live permanently in preparation for your real life. When I become successful, I'll relax. When I reach that level, I'll breathe. When everything is organized, I'll enjoy myself. When I'm finally where I want to be, I'll stop. But what if the unconscious has convinced you that arrival is always somewhere else? What if you're so focused on becoming that you've forgotten how to simply be? And perhaps that is why exhaustion doesn't automatically teach you to rest. Sometimes exhaustion simply makes you more desperate to prove that you can continue. You turn tiredness into another challenge. You become proud of functioning while depleted. You say, I can handle it. And perhaps you can. But the deeper question is, why do you feel compelled to? Because there is a difference between being capable of carrying something and believing you must carry it to remain worthy. That distinction is where the real psychological work begins. Because eventually, the goal isn't to become less ambitious. It is to become free enough that your ambition is a choice, rather than a demand coming from somewhere inside you. And that means confronting the part of you that believes stopping is dangerous, the part that believes rest is weakness, the part that believes everyone else is moving ahead while you're standing still, the part that whispers that if you stop producing, you might finally have to discover whether you know how to value yourself without production. And that question can take you much deeper than any productivity system ever will. And once you begin asking that question, something underneath the surface starts to shift. Because maybe the problem was never that you were too ambitious. Maybe you were never taught the difference between ambition and self-worth. Ambition says, there is something I want to create. Self-worth says, I am still valuable while I'm creating it. Those are not the same thing. When they become fused together, every pause starts feeling personal. A missed workout isn't just a missed workout. It becomes evidence that you're losing discipline. A slow day isn't simply a slow day. It becomes evidence that you're falling behind. A weekend without accomplishing much isn't rest. It becomes something you feel compelled to explain. And this is how an ordinary human need can become a psychological conflict. Your body asks for stillness. Your identity interprets it as failure. Your body says, enough. Your mind answers, not yet. And because the mind has learned to distrust stillness, you keep overriding signals that were never asking you to quit. They were asking you to recover. But there is another layer to this. Sometimes constant productivity isn't only about achievement. Sometimes it is a way of avoiding emotional contact with yourself. When you're constantly occupied, you don't have much room to notice what has been waiting underneath. Disappointment, loneliness, uncertainty, grief, anger, questions about whether the life you're building actually belongs to you. Work can become incredibly effective at keeping those questions quiet. There is always something else to do. Another target, another deadline, another improvement, another problem that needs your attention. And as long as your attention remains outside yourself, you don't have to sit with what is happening within. This is where the unconscious can become strangely clever. It doesn't have to convince you to avoid yourself. It only has to keep you busy. You can spend years calling it ambition while quietly using it as escape. And because the results are visible, nobody questions it. You accomplish things. People admire your discipline. You become dependable. You build a reputation. You may even genuinely enjoy what you're doing. But beneath all of that can exist a quieter question. If I stopped, what would I have to feel? That question can be uncomfortable enough to make rest feel almost unbearable. Because rest removes the distraction. There is no task demanding your attention. No objective telling you what to do next. No achievement giving you immediate feedback. You are simply alone with your own inner world. And suddenly, the silence becomes louder than the work ever was. This is one reason some people reach for their phones the moment they have nothing to do. They scroll. They consume. They check messages. They watch something. They fill every empty space. Not necessarily because they are addicted to stimulation, but because silence creates contact with themselves. And contact with yourself isn't always comfortable, especially when you've spent years organizing your identity around external movement. The unconscious material you avoided through constant activity doesn't disappear. It waits. And when you finally become still, it can begin rising. This is why a quiet afternoon can sometimes produce more anxiety than a 12-hour workday. The workday tells you exactly who you're supposed to be. The quiet afternoon doesn't. And without the role, the performance, the objectives, and the expectations, you are left with yourself. That can feel strangely vulnerable, but it can also become the beginning of something important. Because perhaps the discomfort isn't telling you to get back to work. Perhaps it is showing you how deeply you've attached your identity to being productive. And once you see that, you can begin separating who you are from what you accomplish. You can finish a project without needing it to prove your worth. You can have an ordinary day without turning it into a verdict on your character. You can make mistakes without deciding that you've become a failure. You can rest without having to transform rest into another form of achievement. And perhaps most importantly, you can begin discovering that your value does not increase every time you produce something. It was already there. This is where the shadow can become relevant again. Because the shadow isn't only made of anger or darkness. It can contain the parts of yourself you decided were unacceptable. Perhaps somewhere along the way, you rejected the part of you that wanted to be slow. The part that wanted to play. The part that wanted to do something simply because it was enjoyable. The part that didn't have a measurable outcome. You may have learned to respect only what produces results. So anything without an obvious purpose begins feeling wasteful. Reading for pleasure feels less important than learning something useful. Walking without tracking it feels pointless. Sitting outside feels unproductive. Sleeping longer feels lazy. Even creativity can become contaminated by the need to make something from it. Everything has to lead somewhere. Everything has to count. Everything has to become evidence that you're moving forward. And eventually, you stop experiencing life and start evaluating it. Was today productive? Did I improve? Did I accomplish enough? Did I make progress? But life is not a performance review. There are experiences that don't improve your resume. Moments that don't increase your status. Days that don't move you closer to a measurable goal. And yet those moments can still be deeply meaningful. The unconscious knows this. Your body knows this. But the persona may resist it because the persona survives through performance. It wants to be impressive, useful, successful, needed. So when you rest, the persona becomes quieter. And the quieter it becomes, the more you can hear the person underneath. That person may not want another achievement. Maybe they want space. Maybe they want connection. Maybe they want to experience something without turning it into a goal. Maybe they are simply exhausted from constantly becoming someone else. And this is where rest becomes psychologically significant. Because genuine rest isn't merely the absence of work. It is the absence of performance. For a moment, you don't have to demonstrate anything. You don't have to optimize yourself. You don't have to improve yourself. You don't have to justify your existence through what you accomplish. You simply exist. And if that feels uncomfortable, pay attention. Not because discomfort means you're doing something wrong, but because it may be revealing one of the deepest beliefs you've been carrying. That being is not enough unless it becomes doing. And once you recognize that belief, you can finally begin questioning it. Not by abandoning your goals, not by becoming passive, but by refusing to make your humanity conditional on your output. Because perhaps the real freedom isn't reaching a point where you never feel guilty for resting. Perhaps it is reaching a point where guilt no longer gets to decide what you do next. You can feel the urge to get up and choose to stay. You can feel the voice telling you that you're wasting time. And let the moment exist anyway. You can discover that nothing is collapsing. Nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be proven. And slowly, the nervous system begins learning something the persona never understood. You are allowed to exist even when you are not producing evidence of your worth. And perhaps this is where the deepest shift begins. You stop asking yourself how much more you can accomplish, and start asking what happens to your sense of self when accomplishment is removed. Because if your identity has been built around movement, stillness can feel almost like a loss of identity. You wake up on a morning with nothing urgent to do, and instead of feeling free, you feel behind. There is an almost invisible pressure to make the day count, to extract something from it, to turn it into progress. And even enjoyment can become another form of productivity. You don't simply read. You tell yourself you should learn something from the book. You don't simply exercise. You track the numbers. You don't simply create. You think about whether the creation will perform. You don't simply rest. You wonder whether you're resting efficiently enough. Everything becomes measurable. And when everything is measurable, eventually you start measuring yourself. That is where the persona becomes particularly powerful. Because the productive version of you is easy to recognize. There are achievements. There are results. There are numbers. There is evidence. But the deeper self isn't always measurable. How do you measure the value of being present? How do you measure the importance of a quiet morning? How do you measure emotional recovery? How do you measure the moment when you finally stop fighting yourself? You can't. And perhaps that's exactly why the unconscious part of you has been neglected. You were taught to value what can be demonstrated, so you became very good at demonstrating. But there is a difference between being valuable and being able to prove your value. The first is existence. The second is performance. And when those become confused, life becomes exhausting. Because performance has no natural ending, there is always another level, another target, another person doing more, another version of yourself you think you should become. You can never permanently win a competition whose rules are based on comparison. Even success becomes temporary relief. You accomplish something, and for a moment, you feel safe. Then the feeling fades. So you need another accomplishment, another milestone, another reason to tell yourself, now I'm enough. But the unconscious keeps moving the finish line, not because it wants you to fail, because it was never actually looking for success. It was looking for security, and achievement became the method. This is why someone can have everything they once wanted and still feel internally restless. The external world keeps confirming their success, but the internal world is still waiting for permission to relax. And perhaps the part that needs permission isn't the ambitious part. It's the frightened part. The part that learns somewhere along the way. If I stopped trying, everything could fall apart. Maybe that belief came from comparison. Maybe from expectations. Maybe from an environment where being accomplished earned approval. Maybe from having to become responsible too early. The exact origin can be different, but the psychological pattern can become the same. You learn that movement creates safety, so you keep moving, even when you're tired, even when there is nowhere you actually need to go, even when your body is asking you to stop. And eventually, stopping itself becomes unfamiliar. That is why genuine rest can feel almost like withdrawal. The first quiet moments may not feel peaceful. They may feel irritating. Your mind becomes louder. You suddenly notice thoughts you've been postponing. You remember conversations you haven't processed. You feel emotions that didn't have room to surface during the day. You may even feel an inexplicable sadness. And you might think, something is wrong. But perhaps nothing is wrong. Perhaps something is finally becoming visible. Because when constant activity stops covering the inner world gets a chance to speak. And this is where rest becomes more than recovery. It becomes confrontation. Not confrontation with your workload, confrontation with the identity you've built around it. You begin noticing how often you say, I should, I need to, I have to, I can't waste time, I should be doing more. And slowly, you realize that some of these commands aren't coming from your actual values. They're coming from an internalized authority, a voice that has learned to keep you moving. And because the voice sounds like you rarely question it. But consciousness begins when you can hear a thought without automatically obeying it. You can notice, I feel guilty right now, without concluding. Therefore, I must work. You can notice, I feel behind, without deciding. Therefore, I have to sacrifice my evening. You can notice, I'm afraid I'm wasting time, without immediately filling the time. That small separation is powerful, because now you're no longer being controlled by the feeling. You're observing it. And what you observe consciously no longer has quite the same power over you. This is part of what psychological integration looks like. You don't destroy the ambitious part of yourself. You don't silence the disciplined part. You simply stop allowing one part of your personality to become the entire definition of who you are. You make room for the part that wants to experience, the part that wants to play, the part that wants to sleep, the part that wants to wander without a destination, the part that doesn't need an outcome, the part that can sit in silence without turning the silence into a problem. And perhaps this is where you discover something unexpected. Rest doesn't necessarily make you less ambitious. Sometimes it makes your ambition more honest. Because when you aren't desperately trying to prove your worth through achievement, you can finally ask, what do I actually want? Not what would impress people. Not what would make you look successful. Not what would finally make you feel worthy. What do you want? That question is much harder when you're constantly performing. Because performance tells you what should matter. Stillness gives you the opportunity to discover what actually does. And perhaps that's why rest can become frightening. It gives you back your own voice. Without the deadlines. Without the applause. Without the pressure. Without the endless demand to become more. And the more you hear that voice, the more you may realize that some of the things you've been chasing were never truly yours. Some were inherited expectations. Some were attempts to prove something. Some were ways of outrunning insecurity. Some were simply habits that became identities. And that realization can change the way you work. You stop working because you're afraid of being nothing. You begin working because there is something you genuinely want to express. You stop achieving to earn your right to exist. You begin achieving because creation itself matters to you. You stop resting only when your body forces you to. You begin resting because your life is more than what you can produce from it. And that is a much deeper form of freedom. Because eventually, you can sit still, and nothing inside you has to panic. You can have an ordinary day. You can accomplish very little. You can close the laptop, put the phone down, let the evening pass without turning it into an opportunity. And somewhere inside, the old voice may still whisper, you should be doing something. But now you can answer, I know, and I'm choosing not to. Not from laziness, not from defeat, but from the understanding that your existence does not require constant evidence. You are not only the things you accomplish, you are also the consciousness experiencing them. And perhaps the life you've been working so hard to build was never meant to become another place where you have to prove that you're worthy of being there. And perhaps that is the moment you begin to understand what rest was trying to teach you all along. It was never asking you to become less ambitious. It was asking you to stop confusing movement with meaning. Because there will always be another goal, another deadline, another improvement, another version of yourself you could become. If you make your worth dependent on reaching the next level, you will spend your entire life standing outside yourself, waiting for permission to feel enough. But you don't have to abandon ambition to escape that cycle. You can build without needing the building to prove that you matter. You can work without making work your identity. You can pursue something intensely and still walk away from it at the end of the day. You can want more from your life without believing that what you have right now is insufficient. That distinction is everything, because there is a version of ambition that comes from fear. It says, I need to become more so I can finally be enough. And there is a version that comes from wholeness. It says, I am enough, and I still want to create. From the outside, they may look identical. Both people work hard. Both pursue goals. Both achieve. But internally, they are living completely different lives. One is running from inadequacy. The other is moving from desire. One cannot stop. The other can. One needs the next achievement to feel safe. The other can enjoy the achievement without needing it to define them. And perhaps your real work is not deciding which goals to abandon. It is discovering which part of you is pursuing them. Because if the frightened part is driving everything, no achievement will ever feel like a rival. There will always be another mountain, another standard, another reason you haven't done enough. But when you become conscious of that pattern, you can finally choose differently. You can work because you care. You can rest because you're human. You can accomplish something without immediately demanding more from yourself. You can have a day where nothing remarkable happens and refuse to turn it into evidence against your worth. That may feel unnatural at first. The old voice may protest. It may tell you that you're becoming lazy, that you're losing your edge, that other people are getting ahead, that you should be doing something useful. Listen to it, but don't automatically obey it. Because not every thought deserves authority simply because it has been repeated for years. Sometimes the most important psychological shift is learning to sit with discomfort without immediately converting it into action. You feel guilty. You don't work. You feel restless. You don't reach for another task. You feel behind. You don't punish yourself. You simply observe. And slowly, the mind begins learning that nothing terrible happens when you stop performing. You remain. You are still yourself. Your life is still there. Your worth hasn't disappeared. And eventually, rest stops feeling like surrender. It becomes a return to the part of yourself that existed before productivity became proof, before achievement became identity, before every hour had to justify itself, before you learned to ask, what did I accomplish today? Instead of, how did I experience today? Because there is a life beyond measurable progress. There are conversations that accomplish nothing, walks that lead nowhere, mornings that produce nothing, evenings that don't need to be optimized, moments that cannot be monetized, measured, or displayed. And yet, they may be some of the most alive moments you ever experience. The unconscious does not only need achievement. It needs integration. It needs space. It needs silence. It needs periods where nothing is being demanded from you. Because when you are constantly producing, you only meet the part of yourself that knows how to perform. When you rest, you create space for the parts that were never given permission to speak. The tired part, the curious part, the playful part, the uncertain part, the part that doesn't know what comes next, the part that doesn't need to know. And perhaps that is what you've been missing. Not another strategy, not another routine, not another productivity system, but permission to exist without turning existence into a project. So the next time you finish everything and still feel guilty for stopping, Don't immediately get back up. Stay there. Notice the discomfort. Ask yourself, what am I afraid this rest says about me? Maybe the answer will surprise you. Maybe you'll discover that you're afraid of falling behind. Maybe you're afraid of being ordinary. Maybe you're afraid that someone else will become more successful. Maybe you're afraid that without constant achievement, you won't know who you are. Whatever you find, don't judge it, because awareness is already a form of change. You don't have to destroy the productive version of yourself. You simply have to stop allowing that version to speak for your entire existence. You are more than what you accomplish, more than what you finish, more than how useful you are, more than how disciplined you appear, and more than the future version of yourself you're constantly trying to become. There is also the person sitting here now, the person who is tired, the person who has already survived things, the person who has already accomplished things, the person who doesn't need to earn the right to breathe. And perhaps you have spent so much time trying to build a life worth living that you've forgotten to actually live inside it. So rest, not because you have finally earned it, not because everything is finished, not because you've become productive enough to deserve it. Rest because you are alive. Let the day end without squeezing one more achievement from it. Let yourself do something that has no purpose. Let yourself be still without calling it laziness. Let yourself exist without turning the moment into a measurement. And if guilt appears, let it appear. You don't have to obey it. Because perhaps the greatest freedom isn't becoming someone who can accomplish everything. Perhaps it is becoming someone who no longer needs to accomplish everything to feel worthy. And if these words reached something deeper in you, subscribe to Inner Phoria. Because here, we don't just talk about what you do. We go beneath it, into the unconscious beliefs behind your behavior, the shadow behind your reactions, the persona behind your identity, and the parts of yourself you've been trying to understand without ever having the language for them. So if you've been exhausted from constantly trying to become more, stay. There is nothing wrong with wanting more from your life, but you should never have to hate who you are today. In order to become who you want to be tomorrow, you are allowed to rest before you've earned it. And perhaps the moment you finally believe that, you'll realize you were never failing by stopping. You were simply learning that your worth was never something you had to produce.